Now we will begin the final plenary of today's conference, where we will hear voices from young people on the subject of climate change. Let's start Voices from the Young. I would like to introduce our moderator for this session, Kim Hong-jin, the head youth representative of Coalition for Our Common Future.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Sorry for my sudden outburst into the scene. I was very excited to be moderating this session. So I hope you can understand that part. So as Corinne so kindly mentioned, my name is Hong-jin Kim. I'm currently a researcher at the Coalition for a Common Future, specializing in the Green Big Bang model, particularly in Jeju. Today, I'm here as the head of the youth representative of our Coalition of our Common Future body. And so it's a privilege, as it was the year ago and 2 years ago, to be moderating this very important and exciting session, where in fact, I'm moderating, but after all, it's a session where I learned the most. So without further ado, I would like to first invite a man of supreme integrity, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Germany to the Republic of Korea, Ambassador Michael Reifenstuhl.
Many thanks, dear President Kim Sang-yeop, dear President Ji-ho, dear Kim Hong-jin. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this session in the Seoul Climate Energy Conference. And let me say on behalf of the German Embassy, it's our great appreciation that we have for KAIST, Graduate School for Green Growth, and the Coalition for Our Common Future for organizing this. I think this conference, especially with this plenary, it offers an excellent platform for the young generation. And the young generation, this is actually our future. Initiatives like this are highly important. We need and we should hear what the young people have to say. And let me add, I think you also should listen carefully. In Germany, climate action and protection the environment are, we could say, hot topics for young people. There, the first demonstrations of the so-called Fridays for Future took place in December 2018 already. And in March 2019, at the first global climate strike for future, more than 300,000 pupils from Germany participated from more than 230 cities. As the Federal Environment Minister put it, young people are much more politically minded than many had assumed. They are networking, they are fully aware of the responsibility of their action, what it bears for the future. According to a representative survey, environmental protection and climate change mitigation are the most important issues for young Germans in the age between 14 and 22. On 25th of November, by the way, the German Embassy organized, together with Seoul National University, a student conference for global sustainability. It had the title From Climate Change to Climate Crisis. And students of the Seoul National University who qualified in a contest for the final conference on this date, they showed us their presentation as results of their studies. 14 teams with more than 30 students from various faculties and countries participated in the contest. They prepared presentations on issues like, for example, carbon border tax, effective governance of the climate action regime, decarbonizing food industry, transitioning climate change education, and appropriate technologies. The content and results of the students, let me underline this, were very impressive for us. And one student, who later, by the way, turned out to be an award winner, dedicated her presentation to the importance and effectiveness of environmental education on environmentally sensitive behaviors. The positive influence on environmentally friendly attitude and behavior has been highlighted by many studies, by the way. In other words, improvement in the education on climate change has the potential to make a wide range of people internalize the climate conscious attitudes, and even much more important, also to behave in such a way. For a long time, Germany has been active in incorporating sustainable development in its education curriculum by adopting actions plans related to the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations. The future generations are important and matter. We therefore need to consider the time and the efforts beyond 2030 to reach certain goals. And in Germany, by the way, the Federal Constitutional Court made this very clear in a groundbreaking ruling in March 2021 regarding the federal climate change law. At the highest legal level in our country, this ruling acknowledged the intergenerational justice as one central motive for effective action to protect the climate. Following the ruling, the German lawmakers had to amend the Federal Climate Change Act with more ambitious climate protection goals and, very important, with concrete measures that reflect the interest of the young generation. So I only can underline, I'm looking very much forward, and let's listen to young voices now. I'm convinced that this will give us very valuable insights into how we can move green recovery and just transition forward. And I'm very confident that this will very much enrich the discussions on climate-friendly solutions for the future. Thank you. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, I remember when I first heard the word climate change, it was almost 20 years ago. And during that time, I was anxious, I was worried, but then 20 years passed, and now the mainstream jargon is climate crisis. Now, I come to think about it. What has happened over the past two decades? I can maybe summarize it in 2 words: inaction and incompetence. Now, the ambassador has mentioned that it's an intergenerational justice issue. And perhaps who better to explain this from a fellow colleague of mine from Germany, who's also studying at the KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth. Valentina, please share your sentiments or the sentiments of the German youth with our audiences here today.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you also, Ambassador, for your kind words. It's a great honor to be able to speak here today, and I would like to thank especially Professor Kim for his support. My name is Valentina. As mentioned, I am a KAIST graduate student of Green Growth. Coming originally from Germany, what I would like to talk about today is strongly in line with what the ambassador mentioned in his introduction to this conference. Voices of the youth, especially voices of young Germans in light of climate change. In recent years, the direct impact of global warming has become almost tangible in Germany. This was most obvious when we had to witness close friendships such as Turkey and Greece burn up in flames following years of overly hot summers and droughts, while in Germany, unprecedented floods in April cost the lives of hundreds, and we were still zipping up our jackets trying to stay warm in June. Having climate change play out so directly in front of us, something that has impacted the lives of young Germans for quite some time has now become crystal clear. Fear. Fear for the future. Fear of not having a future. Apparently, there's even a scientific term for it. Climate anxiety. And as far as I can stand here today and speak for the German youth, I would say climate anxiety affects the grand majority of us. Not only do less and less Germans want kids, and that's not because babies are a lot of work and costly, no. Much more is this due to the fact that people don't want their children to grow up in the world we're currently heading towards. In my experience, young people in Germany are frustrated and hopeless. Because why should we still try? Why should we try to do well in school, to get into a good university, to get a well-paying job? What for? To fuel the economy that is de facto currently costing us our future? Against this rather grim picture, however, I want to touch upon what the ambassador has mentioned before, and that is the historic 21 Supreme Court ruling that determined that parts of Germany's climate law are unconstitutional. Why historic, you might ask? Because this court ruling gives some sort of legally binding grounds to the Paris Agreement and the 1.5-degree goal. And most importantly, the ruling is based on concerns for future generations. Now, let me elaborate a bit. In 2019, the German government updated a climate strategy in which CO2 reduction goals until the year 2030 were outlined. Not much later, however, legal action was taken by citizens, the majority of which are people from my generation. They argued that the law does not sufficiently address the issue of climate change, and indeed, in 2021, Germany's Supreme Court ruled that the outlined reduction goals were insufficient and, most importantly, unconstitutional. Why? Because the law does not outline carbon reduction goals after 2030. As fleshed under the Paris Agreement, however, Germany is supposed to become carbon neutral by 2050. Hence, a vast majority of the carbon reduction work would have to be done after 2030. And when I use the word vast, I quite literally mean so. If Germany would proceed as outlined in its current climate law, most of the available carbon budget would be used up by 2030. And that would force much more ambitious and strict CO2 reductions in the following years. Now, one point to consider is that CO2 emissions are basically tied to any part of human life. So thinking about it, in order to meet the carbon neutrality target, people would have to severely restrict themselves in their daily activities, their travel, their consumption, and so much more. And that is exactly where the German Supreme Court ruling found the law to be unconstitutional. The German Constitution says clearly that the government has the obligation to protect the life and freedom of future generations. With current 2030 goals, this freedom of young people like me would be severely infringed upon. Historic. Thinking about it, this court ruling basically says that when designing laws today, the most important aspect to consider isn't how many cars with diesel motors we're still allowed to sell, or how to ensure certain politicians' re-election, or how to make lobbyists or the pharmaceutical industry happy. No. Rather, it's all about how to secure the freedom of future generations to live a decent life. Now, remember what I said about climate anxiety and the hopelessness among the German youth? In April 2021, this court ruling, it might be a beacon of light, as it considers us young people as the most important stakeholders in the climate debate. Hence, I would like to close with this. Speaking for the German youth today, I will say I am still scared of the future, scared that I won't have a future. However, since April 2021, I'm scared, but I also have hope. I have hope that my concerns will no longer be ignored. I have hope that I will have a future worth living in. I have hope, and I hope you share this with me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Valentina. I surely hope that we construct a better future. And the best way to do it, I find it, is to gather forces, muster forces of the young, of the youth, not just from shouting out and going to the streets, but actually going to study something, experimenting with new technologies, learning about scientific experiments. And what better way to do this when we have a wonderful professor in Kim Sang-yup who have gathered a wonderful cohort of presenters. Now in the following 30 minutes, we're going to sprint to the various ideas that concerns youth empowerment. So beginning with Sejin, our Climate Scout representative. Climate Scout is a program launched by the Coalition for a Common Future. Sejin will review the outcomes of the pre-COP Milan and how it affects our society, how it affects the youth and our future. Sejin, microphone is yours.
Thank you. I'm Sejin Kim of Climate Scouts, a youth program for the Coalition of Our Common Future. Thank you for allowing me to share my opinions at the Honorable Seoul Climate Energy Conference. Through this session, I'll talk about the results of the youth's actions regarding pre-COP26 in Milan.
While Sejin is preparing his presentation, I encourage you to upload any questions you might have onto YouTube. I think our panelists and discussants will be ready to answer them whenever they're ready. Sejin, are you ready?
Sorry, let me share my screen.
All right.
Okay, I'm ready.
Go ahead.
So from September 28th to 30th, nearly 400 youths gathered from 186 countries to share the priorities and key agendas of climate behavior. Participants used their days to develop a manifesto featuring a discussion and a declaration between the youth delegates and ministers attending COP26. The youth delegates formed 4 working groups according to the following thematic areas: youth driving ambition, sustainable recovery, non-state actors engagement, and climate consciousness society. From now on, I'll briefly tell you the summary according to the 4 working groups. The first working group is Youth Driving Ambition, divided into 3 keywords. First keyword is meaningful participation. This involves requesting stakeholders to ensure youth engagement, including decision-making on climate policies at the multilateral, national, and local levels. Secondly, is capacity building, which requests countries to foster the engagement of youth in driving climate ambition and action. Lastly, funding. This requests public and public institutions to dedicate funds to support youth participation. Nextly, to the second working group was sustainable recovery. It can be summarized into 5 words. Firstly, energy transition and green jobs. In this case, youths call for an energy transition by 2030, keeping a plus 1.5 goal within reach. This includes transition with decent jobs, providing adequate support for vulnerable communities. The second keyword is adaptation, resilience, loss, and damage, which demands the safety of the most vulnerable groups and regions through locally owned adaptations. The third subject is nature-based solutions. They require NBS to be prioritized as a key to protecting indigenous people's rights and place-based knowledge. Fourthly, financial flows, urging decision makers to create a transparent and accountable climate finance system with a robust regulation of carbon emissions. Lastly, tourism. They call for the inclusion of all stakeholders in capacity building towards green tourism and equipment. The third group is called non-state actors engagement, which can be summed up into 3 subjects. Firstly, infrastructure and finance for non-state actors, which supports the participation of young entrepreneurs, artists, athletes, and on. This can be done by facilitating access to financing, as well as the development of critical infrastructure. The second topic reports to non-party stakeholder alignment with net zero goals. This requires them to align operations to net zero emissions with clear reporting of milestones on an annual basis. Thirdly, fossil fuel influence on non-state actors. This indicates that the abolition of fossil fuels industry must be done by 2030. Non-state actors must not accept any fossil fuel investment, especially in relation to international negotiations. The last group supports their ideas through manifesting climate-conscious society, which can be summed up into 4 topics. First topic is showcasing impact and solutions. Decision makers need to be held accountable in working with youth to amplify diverse voices. They must support the creation of multi-stakeholder mechanisms for sharing climate information. Secondly, we must take education into account. This involves calling on governments to ensure comprehensive climate change education. In addition to education, youth should have access to funding and capacity building activities. Thirdly, public awareness and mobilization are needed. We need to empower every person in the world to be part of the climate solution and also ensure that everyone can participate in the decision-making processes. The last keyword is media. This regards training communicators to convey the implications of the climate crisis in an accessible manner. It also involves preventing greenwashing and on. So following the simple summary, I'll tell you my impressions of this decision. In my point of view, the most important thing to pay attention to in this manifesto can be summed up into 2 words: embracement and finance. First, it's embracement. Through this declaration, youth urge special attention to those who are especially vulnerable to climate change. In this case, vulnerability mostly refers to relative incompetence in adaptation. The manifesto includes the word vulnerable region and community in almost every topic to be fulfilled, hoping that the steps toward net zero will not be the exclusive property of the ahead. We're particularly wary of the logic of the strong that allows only a few precedent countries or companies to get most of the benefits and safety regarding climate change. Responding to climate crisis should be a risk and an opportunity for everyone as a whole. We'll make sure that there will be no stakeholders falling behind in the flow of green, and I also encourage your participation in it. Secondly, finance. The key driving force behind youth streams and justifications in climate change lie in sustainable financial flow. This is because a sustainable response system cannot be created without a steady and circulating inflow of funds. In fact, the word related to finance was mentioned 80 times in this manifesto. To this extent, youth recognize that the role of finance is essential to fulfilling their goals. Therefore, we need ways to internalize green into finance so that the funds can circulate throughout the system. So at this moment, I urge the business and financial stakeholders, as well as the government, to put their efforts in building a green business infrastructure by internalizing green and ESG in their business models. This will allow youth to grow up and participate freely in various projects with longer funding. To sum up, this event has great significance in that the international community is recognizing the youth as a central pillar of responding to climate change. However, despite their importance, the detailed arguments delivered to COP26 discussion fail to materialize all of our ambitions. We'll never stop until our ambitions are realized, so I hope that the primary decision makers will be able to listen to us and our thoughts as key stakeholders regarding climate change. That's it today for today's speech, and thank you for listening.
Wonderful sum up of the pre-COP Milan and of your idea. Very good. So next we move on to Jiho, who will talk about the intergenerational justice, also mentioned by the ambassador. So Jiho, take the mic.
Thank you, Hongjin. Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be speaking in front of you all today. My name is Jiho Park, and I'm from the Republic of Korea. I'm currently a master's student at the KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth. Scientists claim that we have already entered the era of Anthropocene, which involves human beings permanently changing various Earth systems, including the climate. News of the extinction of species, extreme weather events, food shortages, and global pandemic are just a few of the consequences of climate change that we already see on a day-to-day basis. These climate-related disasters are only going to exacerbate exponentially, affecting not just us, but future generations. However, in the current mode of capitalism, which prioritizes short-term economic gains, taking future generations into account seems unrealistic. So it might seem natural to wonder whether we have an obligation to look out for the future generations. Intergenerational justice and the interests of future generations have been a hot topic of debate among philosophers, lawyers, and political leaders for centuries. Some argue that future generations, especially those who are not born, cannot possess rights, legal or otherwise. And this is more or less reflected in most legal systems around the world today. So I go back to the question at hand. Do we have a moral obligation to children as well as future generations? And my answer to this is absolutely yes. Morally speaking, at the core of it, this really is not a controversial issue. Put simply, climate change is killing people, and it will continue to do so. As a society, a fundamental basic moral principle that we all have is to not do serious harm to others. The youth and future generations to come are the ones who will have to bear the brunt of the consequences of our action or inaction. Therefore, they have the right to hold us accountable, but as they are unable to voice their opinions, both due to the fact that they are not included in current power structures or not yet born, we have a moral obligation to do right by them. Additionally, climate change is undeniable, and it will only get harder to solve as time goes on. The longer we hold off on making meaningful change, the greater the burden the next generation will have to bear, and the more difficult any kind of action to undo the damage will be. Passing off this issue, which will determine their survival on this planet, is morally wrong. To achieve intergenerational equity, we should aim to leave the next generation with a robust planet that is in no worse shape than how we received it. Finding a solution to climate change should not be seen as zero-sum. Instead, we should look at the human community as a partnership among all generations. And since future generations have the greatest stake in whatever solutions are developed, they are entitled to participate in creating these solutions. This should be the norm and not the exception. Giving youth activists a voice at global conferences like COP is simply not enough. The current power structures need to change and create seats at the table for younger generations. Finally, I'd like to wrap up with some recent discoveries in science. Ecologists have discovered that trees collaborate and communicate intergenerationally to support not only their own offspring, but other species too. And this collaborative effort is actually what makes the forest at large thrive. I think we can all learn a lesson or two from the trees and forests around us, and hopefully we humans can also find solidarity across generations. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one of the ways to not be left out in this global charge against climate change or climate crisis is education, training ourselves, learning more about what's going around. And who else than to tell this about than Amy. Amy, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Hongjin. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here today. I am Amy Aditya from Indonesia. I'm currently studying social entrepreneurship MBA at KAIST. In this opportunity, I would like to discuss my perspective on the importance of capacity building focusing on education for tackling climate change issues. As we all know that, according to the COP26 result, there is still a huge gap on 1.5 degrees targets. To cover these gaps, what should we do? What should we, especially the young generations, do? Do future generations aware of these targets, of these climate change risks that are coming upon us? Before coming to Korea, I never thought climate change was severe. I believe it is due to the lack of awareness that I failed to be aware of. So as a young generation, I would like to emphasize the importance of capability building focusing on education for the young generation to build up awareness towards climate change to the younger generation. Why education? Whether we realize it or not, we never stop learning. Life never stops teaching us new things. Thus, capacity building on education could be one of the many ways to tackle this problem to become a concrete measure to achieve 1.5 degrees targets by increasing awareness within the society. Therefore, any industries such as schools shall be enforced to increase awareness of climate change. Green growth shall become common knowledge for everyone, regardless of age. After all, the extent to which climate change will impact our society depends on exposure at all levels, local and international. However, we should take care of the capacity building from the grassroots level, especially in developing countries. Thus, we need to strengthen the national capacity to tackle climate change by taking care of it from the grassroots level. Hence, focusing on raising awareness through education in schools is one way to do it. Again, capacity building and mass education are crucial enablers to achieving strategic and sustainable objectives, specifically climate change. Now, we are far from achieving the 1.5 degrees target, which would still have severe consequences for our societies and even more significant impact on the most vulnerable countries, groups, and individuals. To tackle climate change, we need ambitions. We need more people to act, move, and initiate the solutions to cover the gaps to maintain 1.5 degrees Celsius. We need more people to be aware and act together to reach 1.5 degrees to keep on living. So please put more faith in the young generation. Let's focus on capacity building on education to raise more awareness of climate change within the young generation globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Faith in the young and faith in education goes hand in hand, in combating climate crisis. Now, as an engineer who was trained at KAIST, this next topic regarding science will be one that interests me very much, and Sumin will help me elaborate on this fact regarding youth empowerment.
Thank you, Hongjin, and hello, everyone. I'm Sumin Kim from Republic of the Korea, and I'm also studying in KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth as previous student Valentina and Jiho. And first, thank you for having me in this session, especially for Professor Kim Sang-yeop. It's a great honor to be here and have this opportunity. And today, I would like to present about why science, research, and innovation must lie at the core of climate change debate. The COP26 summit brought parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. UNFCCC was established following the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio, so-called the Earth Summit. And since then, it could be possible to say that the world has been trying to avoid the world's worst climate impacts and maintain a livable climate, making the world more sustainable for future generations. However, to do so, how can we find out what the future generations will need? I would like to talk about it here, refer to John Linhans from his book. For him, in the language used by economists, it is a matter of analyzing the stocks of resources that are passed on from one generation to the next. And stocks can be exhaustible, like minerals and planetary carbon sink, or renewable, like water. So the well-being of future generations depends on the stock of resources passed on to them, as well as their quality in the case of renewable resources. Other important capital stocks are human capital, determined through expenditure on education and research, and the quality of the institutions bequeathed to future generations. Also, as a capital stock, more representative and more participatory governance processes are likely to enhance and widen the choices available to future generations. The important ingredients for future-oriented policymaking is an effective way to channel relevant science to decision makers, as well as for them to share policy questions with scientists, the so-called science policy interface. COP26 also contains the structure for engagement on science policy, and in doing so, adds to the conditions for future-oriented policymaking. Science and research are the key for future-oriented policymaking, as they can help us understand the potential implications of our actions for future generations. For example, the exhaustion of a non-renewable resource or the crossing of thresholds and tipping points. So accurate knowledge on the state of the environment and natural resources can serve to prompt the research the search for alternatives and substitutes, whether in response to market signals or through government-funded research and development. So it will be important that decisions affecting future generations are made in transparent way, as discussed on COP26, with the underlying assumptions made available. It is also important to select and use discount rates appropriately for the particular issue being addressed, and if possible, to assess an array of scenarios covering whether and by how much future generations will be better off. Relevant, reliable, and timely data are important to measurement of progress. And COP26 significantly expanded the demand for data, and it recognizes the importance of building capacity to meet this need. And thank you very much for listening.
Neat presentation, Sumin. Thank you for that last remark, that COP26 was not all despair, as many of the media are touting. Look into the details and we can find that science will be the basis for policy building. Now, regarding policy, it's a very difficult topic when politics interfere with the discussion of climate change or climate crisis. You've seen what happened in the United States. Now, Rory can expand on this, having been through this similar situation in Australia. So Rory, please tell us about the role of politics or the ombudsman, a topic that you're a very expert of.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Hongjin, and good afternoon, morning, or evening to all attendees and esteemed guests of the 8th Annual Seoul Climate Energy Conference, wherever you may be joining us from. My name is Rory, and I'm a first-year student at KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth. It truly is my pleasure to be given this opportunity today to present to you on this topic of functional politics and its importance in our long-term ability to address climate change. So I must first be honest, last month when I learned that I would be presenting on this topic here, I wondered to myself, what salient example can I point to that might highlight how strongly we as a community should feel about this issue? Well, fortunately, or truly unfortunately, I suppose, I didn't have to look very far. As I pondered my question, media platforms across the globe were flooded by the same story of outrage. That is, while government delegations sat inside the plenary at the 26th Conference of Parties, making decisions that condemned the global community to yet another year of anxiety and suffering at the hands of the climate crisis, activists from all walks of life rallied together outside the venue in Glasgow, protesting for their voices to be heard. Now, we can say whatever we want about the outcomes of COP26, but one thing that it showed us all is that governments are not listening to the people. And whatever one's interpretation of what functional politics might mean, this surely cannot be it. If we are to address the climate crisis, then we simply must demand urgent action from global leaders and find ways to hold them accountable if they fail to deliver. But this quest for government accountability has been an age-old challenge for civil actors. In my view, it hinges on two fundamental ideas. One, that the public have the ability and autonomy to actively inspect and scrutinize policy, and two, that this criticism is able to be converted into tangible consequences that are deliverable to those in power. So how then can we enforce this? What institutional models do we have at our disposal to encourage functional politics? If you couldn't already tell from my accent, I grew up overseas in Australia. Like many other states, Australia largely relies on an institution known as the Ombudsman to critique public administration. For those unfamiliar, an ombudsman uses the power vested in it by legislation to investigate complaints made by the public that concern the misconduct of government agencies. On paper, this sounds like a healthy, dare I say, functional system. But you see, despite its independent status, the Ombudsman is made static by the archaic frameworks of administrative laws that dictate it, and its continued reliance on the public sector for its resourcing. When looking at the case of my home country, the inefficacy of such an institution at holding the government to account on emerging issues such as climate change that do not yet have well-defined legal and ethical guidelines is blatantly clear. Despite global warming frequently ranking as a primary concern of Australian citizens, our government's performance at the most recent Conference of Parties saw it rank dead last out of all participating countries in regard to its policy response to the climate crisis. Truthfully, I would find this more laughable if its consequences weren't so dire, not least for us in Australia, but for our island neighbours in Oceania, who, as we know, will be the first to feel the impacts of our inaction on climate. Moreover, my government's lack of action exemplifies the clear schism on climate change that exists between the public and the governments that are meant to represent them, even in countries like Australia that are considered among the most stable democracies. In this sense, one key lesson that we can learn from the shortcomings of Australia and its ombudsman is that it seems, so long as that we let them, governments will use formalized layers of bureaucracy to elude the issues that subvert their authority. But we can't afford to treat climate change like any other political issue. It is far too complicated, and more than that, it's far too urgent. Where existing institutions like the Ombudsman fall short in reprimanding governments, through collective action, we must demand the establishment of new institutions with formal mandates that facilitate negotiation between public office and civil society. It is only when we are able to establish a more direct, dynamic, and constructive dialogue between policymakers and the public that they are meant to represent that we will truly have a functional political system which might just be capable of providing long-term solutions to the climate crisis. I understand I don't have much time left in my speech, so I'd like to wrap up with a message to fellow youth climate activists. While COP26 was certainly disappointing, we should not label its outcome as a complete failure. Dealing in such binaries shatters hope, and that is something that we, as the youth, cannot afford. When traditional institutions prove ineffective at reprimanding governments, I urge you to not give up. Rather, we must remain disruptive, we must remain unapologetic, and we must remain consistent in our demand for a more functional political system that promises to enact change on climate. Thank you so much to the organizers of today's conference for lending me this platform, and I hope that all the viewers enjoy the rest of today's session. Thank you, Hongjin.
You're welcome, Rory. I hope that in next pre-COP, you'll be alongside me walking in the streets of wherever pre-COP will take place, shouting out slogans, but not only that, actually trying to be there to bring about a change. You mentioned about Australia being a very stable democracy. Korea may be close enough, but there are concerns about the democratic system and its role in how to solve the climate crisis. And Miriam will talk about this short-termism that underlies, that may damage our efforts, our democratic system's efforts to combat the climate crisis. Miriam?
Thank you so much, Hongjin, and greetings to everyone. My name is Miriam Jiang, a student at the KAIST Graduate School of Management, and I am from Cameroon. I am grateful for the opportunity to present at this conference, and I will be talking on the danger of short-termism. The advances witnessed in recent decades promise a future which is full of opportunity, but sadly enough, highly uncertain and characterized by growing systemic risks, which in most cases are consequences of our success. Today, we must, more than ever, be aware of the implications of our actions on future generations, because from the trend of events, it is obvious that we are among the last generations with the chance to stop the long-term, irreversible devastation of our planet. The late French politician Pierre Mendès used to say, "Gouverner, c'est prévoir," which means governing is foreseeing. Preparing for the future, however, seems a luxury for today's governments, who are increasingly preoccupied with the present, which offers quicker and potentially easier payoffs at lower costs at the expense of long-term rewards and security. This phenomenon is referred to as short-termism and has fast become a natural human tendency. Most probably for the rest of humankind, climate change will be the challenge around which short-term thinking and long-term consequences will collide for businesses, governments, and citizens. Meeting the challenge of climate change calls on all parties to assess the risks and act before the economic and environmental consequences of failure become irreversible. Likened to a disease, short-termism poses several threats in the fight against climate change. The interests of current generations are favored over those of future generations, with politicians being generally unwilling to commit to and reluctant to engage in long-term and intergenerational policies. The needs of the future generations are discounted and their rights violated. It is worth noting that the approach to meeting the needs of generations varies depending on whether they are viewed from an intragenerational, intergenerational, transgenerational, or multi-generational perspective. Short-termism prevents proper investments, that could mitigate future impacts of climate change, placing the burdens and repercussions of the actions of the present generation on future generations. Given the prospect of a very positive, but also a possibly disastrous future, government's responsibility to address current needs and build the foundations for vibrant generations in the decades ahead transcends their obligations to today's citizens and relates to future generations, requiring us to leave the world better than we found it. Unfortunately, some governments from across the world have for years put their energy policy in the too hard to think about box, and they are unwilling and unable to decide whether or not to commit to renewables. Of governments, however, like Finland, Hungary, Germany, and Wales, are reassuringly trying to intentionally reframe their work to meaningfully include the generations to come and plan further into the future. They have done so far. In the attempt to fight short-termism and its effects on the future generations, there is need for strict implementations of the resolutions of the COP26 summit, which saw, among other outcomes, the adoption of a Glasgow Climate Pact to keep the 1.5 degrees centigrade pledge alive, the need to urgently revisit and strengthen climate pledges by the end of 2022, stronger commitments towards quality climate finance, and the prospects of allowing countries to earn credits, not only from emissions reductions, but also, and even more, from emissions avoidance. The Republic of Korea pledged at COP26 to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030 and to attain carbon neutrality by 2050. So how does the present leadership and those aspiring to take over in the days ahead plan to bring this to reality? With a short-term political cycle in Korea, how will sustainability, continuity, and transparency be ensured even after leaving office? It is clear that the world faces long-term challenges, and they will only become more acute if we keep deviating from the truth. More often than not, we neglect the well-being of our future selves, so it will even be harder to muster empathy for our descendants. Saving the planet by doing away with short-termism will take a man on the moon commitment, which begins from extrapolating how our different acts as individual persons, communities, and nations might affect the wider world and its population today, let alone hundreds of years into the future. It is so hard to change, firstly because our institutions and systems were built for the well-being of the present and not necessarily the future. And secondly, the outcome of combating short-termism will never be known by the present generation, given that there is no control group. May I end by saying that taking a longer view is good, but being able to strike a sustainable balance between short-term and long-term interests is the best, because you will agree with me, the long-term is now, and soon may be too late. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam. Very powerful speech. Thank you once again for all the speakers who went before, because Sivantek right now will sort of give a summary of why this is important to the future generation. Go ahead, the microphone is yours.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Kim and Hong Jin for having me. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ivan Saknek, coming from Cambodia. I am currently pursuing social entrepreneurship MBA at KAIST. Regarding intergenerational independent institution for the future generation, across the country in European Union, various institutions for future generation has been established amid strong agreement among the policymakers, scientists, and environmentalists. In spite of the growth of the legislation and policy implementation, we could see the huge gap and might be potentially led to the policy failure because of the tendency of the core remit of the policy. Let me illustrate about the Germany case. In the parliamentary context, the German committee is focused more broadly on sustainable development in comparison to the Finnish parliamentary committee on the future generation. There is obviously a difference in name here, but this has translated into function as well. Before the SDG, the German committee used assessment framework which assess and scrutinize legislation and policy through three principles, one of which was the intergenerational equity. However, because the focus of this committee is sustainable development, when the SDG were agreed, the committee reframed their work around the SDG more broadly because of the institution core remit is not explicitly focused on the future generation. For instance, in 2016, when the political priority transitioned to prioritize the SDG, the priority of the committee were pushed to another direction. How about EU level? We could see that within the EU institutions themselves, there is also the possibility to include rights or concern for the future generation in various ways. The clearest opportunity can be found in relation to the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union, the charter that brings together the most important personal freedom and rights enjoyed by the citizens of the EU into one legally binding document which came into force in 2009. In this charter, the Article 2 mentioned about the rights to life has been used on the multiple occasions in some countries. For example, in India, there is a win case at the state level about the future generation. In addition to that, Article 6, the rights to the liberty and security, it could be more rapidly used to defend the rights of young people and children. While they are not unborn future generation, their expected lifespan extend into the future in a way that it makes it possible to draw the connection in principle. In our thought, the well-being of the future generation acts require the public bodies to take account with the clear of the structuralization of the impact that their decision could have on the people living their lives in the future. I truly believe that what we are doing today, for example, fight for the climate change, gender equity, sustainable development, are all to reserve for the next generation. But still, there is no specific declaration mentioned to credit all the work for the future generation. Core of the design of the institution for the future generation is the part of process of future making. To conclude, the future is not something to be defended, it's something to be created. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Very sharp presentation. Now, Taha, you're the last of the presenters before we move into the discussion. So what questions remain in terms of empowering the youth? Over to you.
Okay, thank you and good evening, everyone. It's a great honor for me to speak here today. My name is Taha Al-Wahsh from Palestine. I'm a student of Social Entrepreneurship MBA at KAIST. Today, I will talk about some of the important questions in order to achieve the accountability. The first question is, should accountability be linked to an independent judicial system that guarantees fair enforcement and protection for all parties? And is this possible in reality? Where complex webs of personal and institutional relationships exist in our real world, then how do we ensure that different streams of accountability do not conflict with each other? To what extent do rigid laws and administrative procedures inhibit our ability to exercise ethical, future-oriented decision-making when it comes to public policy? What are the means to ensure that government meets its accountability obligations? is attempting to embed accountability into existing frameworks of administrative law and best step to go forward, or there is more innovative approach required to achieve that? So to answer these questions, it's necessary to think about proposed pathways, like in order to implement accountability in an effective manner, relevant legal frameworks must hold power over the public office, while not hindering its work. Political interferences in the work of regulatory, judicial bodies, and institutions must be prevented. Legal frameworks are imperfect, and there's a dire need to address existing loopholes and proposing new legislation, particularly at the administrative level. Administrative law needs to be developed to include clear foundations for organizing the accountability process within the state. Also, it's incredibly necessary to empower civil and local society to play a more effective role in contributing to its ongoing dialogue on governmental policies that will affect future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Taha. Well, empowerment of the young generation, we began the discussion with that and eventually ended. So what's left, I believe, is the empowerment of the young generation in the era of climate change. Now, we're running out of time, just as Earth is running out of time. So, Jack, I would like to introduce you as a very close colleague of mine who have participated in our last CEC and who was kind enough to participate once again. So, Jack, please give us a brief summary of your take of today's Voice from the Young session. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Hongjin. It's a great pleasure to be here again, having been here last year. My name's Jack Baith. I'm from the United Kingdom. And I have to say, it's really wonderful to have heard from all of our colleagues so far today. And as someone who was here last year, I think the diversity in backgrounds this year really is a testament to the efforts of the conference organizers and to the common urgency we share globally in facing the climate crisis. I think what we've heard today is very powerful. So to briefly reflect before I move on to a small message of my own, what we've heard so far consisted, well, we heard from Aditya to begin with. We spoke of the need to transform our somewhat niche knowledge of climate change and green growth into a common knowledge. And I really agree with that. I think that's a very poignant point that she brought up. I recently wrote a paper to be published in Chungang University here in Korea, which focuses on that emerging element of common knowledge to form a global climate change culture. And the analysis in that paper suggests that we're all expecting more from our governments. That really echoes what we've heard today from our speakers. Those in power must do more. So just a short while ago, we heard from Savansek, who spoke of how our future generations must be considered as we create our future. And it's worth remembering they are our future generations. They're not some mysterious other, they're extensions of ourselves. Jiho talked about the idea of intergenerational justice and the basic principle of not doing serious harm to others. And Rory noted that functional politics is, well, to be plain, not so functional, archaic even, and that we must have mechanisms available to us to deliver appropriate consequences to those in power when they fail to represent the interest of society. Miriam pointed out that we need to find a balance in our long-term and short-term thinking. And as I said, the culmination of what they've said today is extremely powerful. It's an ideal goal which we must work towards achieving. However, there are some hurdles in our path, and Rory encouraged being unapologetic in demanding action. I'm going to be extremely unapologetic in what I'm about to say. So, a small message from myself. Let me bring your attention to some news from the UK. As we're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has meant that societies around the globe have needed to make uncomfortable adjustments in the pursuit of our common well-being and safety. And this time last year, the UK had some very strong restrictions on social gatherings, especially over the festive period. Yet most recently, a video recording came to light showing staff members of number 10 Downing Street, which is the home of the Prime Minister, laughing and joking about having a party despite restrictions, and openly thinking of how to adjust their terminology so to avoid calling it a party. One member of staff joked, it was not socially distanced, and I can assure you not one single member of society to have obediently followed government guidance found this to be a laughing matter. But why am I talking about this? Well, this sparked well-justified outrage in the UK. When our leaders ask us to make accommodations for the common good, we must be able to believe that they themselves are working in aid of that goal. When those in power cannot lead by example, they inevitably forfeit any authority they might have on the matter. So to tie this into climate change, at COP26, Prime Minister Boris Johnson decided to fly back to London from Glasgow on a private jet. Yet later in the conference, he travelled back to Glasgow by train, following considerable public backlash, proving that it was entirely possible in the first instance. Now, we've heard plenty here today from our speakers on the need for intergenerational cooperation and the need for those in power to open the door to the young. But what can the youth do when those at the top aren't willing to act as conduits for this cooperation? What happens when their actions make them so illegitimate that any semblance of authority is washed away? How can we believe in that? What I would say to the youth is that we must vote well. As ex-President Barack Obama said at COP26, politics isn't something you can ignore. And you have to vote like your life depends on it, because it does. We must en masse vote strategically to ensure these pathways can be made. As Rory mentioned, ombudsmen can be installed to oversee the government. But to what extent do we really expect the political elite to hand over the keys to their freedom to act with relative impunity? We're beginning to reach this critical mass at which our votes can install those working to bring government into a new era. And really, we no longer have the time to afford benefit of the doubt to those in power who believe themselves to be an exception of the rules and apologize only when caught breaking them. This rapid change is required, and those with the ability to enable intergenerational cooperation must be installed as a priority. I think my message reflects that largely of the speakers here today, and I hope it's been very informative for you. Thank you for
You're welcome, Jack, and thank you for your very strong message. You do realize, despite my calm composure right now, I share your anger and I would burst out. Now, there is one man still listening to all of our conversation, an esteemed man who is determined to solve or set an example of that intergenerational conflict. I would like to re-invite His Excellency, the German Ambassador, Michael Reifenstuhl, for a closing remark. Ambassador.
Dear Jin, many thanks and congratulations to all who participated. When I said at the very beginning, I'm really eager to listen to it because I think we, the older generation, it is a task that we listen to you. I realized in the past 45 minutes, it's more than worth listening to you. So one remark as a representative from Germany, and then I would make also 1-2 remarks simply as a parent of 3 children that are also now grown up and that are studying and that are concerned about the environment. So there was a lot of mentioning also about the issue how to involve the younger generation more in the political process and how also to give them a vote. One example, for example, that we have done now in Germany with the new incoming government. You know that we have since Wednesday late afternoon we have a new government after 16 years of former Chancellor Angela Merkel. Is that they decided in the coalition government program that will be now implemented in the next years, actually that the age of voting for the parliament will be lowered from 18 years, that it has been for quite a long time. At the very beginning of the Republic, it was 21, then it was lowered to 18. And then they decided now in the government program that it will be lowered to 16 years. So I think this is one way, but it's only one way how this really also can be more reflected. So two remarks, perhaps not as a government official, but as a father. And I think we also talked a lot about this intergenerational dialogue, and I think this is indeed important because when I'm talking with my 3 kids, we do this always once a week over WebEx because they're all studying in Germany. I realized, and I made the experience. The learning process is mutual. Yeah, it's a two-way road. I'm also learning a lot of simply listening to my daughter and my 2 boys. First remark. Second remark would be it was mentioned, and I think this is always personally important to be credible. We, the older generation, also have to set the right good examples. I think this is for everybody very, very important. There was one sentence I really liked very much in the speech when it was said, we never stop learning. I think this is one of the most fundamental sentences you can say, because I think it's not a question of age, but it is simply a question of having an open mind, that you're always able to learn, also to realize perhaps that you have to change your own behavior. Second remark on this one would be, it was also said, you, the young generation, the next generation, is actually, you are the stakeholders, because you are the one actually who have to live with the climate change much more than my own generation. So I simply wanted to say, challenge us. It's your future, and we should listen to you. And again, many, many thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And on behalf of the senior members of KAIST professorships and the management at the Coalition for a Common Future, not only thank you for your service here in the Korea-Germany relationship, but also for your fight against climate change. That's coming directly out from my heart. And building and wrapping up on your second comment, we are indeed the stakeholders of this planet. We will be, and our children will be, in the near future. And as Harry Truman said, imperfect action is much better than perfect inaction. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you very much for your very moving stories and thoughts, which I'm sure we can all agree were inspirational, critical, and I believe optimistic. Today was a very meaningful opportunity for us to reflect on the progress that has been made and to consider the numerous opportunities that lie ahead of us.